Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So, have you ever picked up a spiritual book, read a sentence like 3 times, and still had absolutely no idea what it was trying to say? Well, I have, probably numerous times. But about 10 years ago, I picked up a course in miracles and I could not get through it. The sentences were just so dense and layered, I couldn't even figure out what a single paragraph was trying to say, let alone the deeper meaning underneath it. So I put it down and I walked away. Recently, I picked it up again and something remarkable had happened, not to the book, but to me. I could read it, not just follow words, but actually feel what they were pointing to. The book hadn't changed, but apparently my consciousness had. But here's what I kept coming back to. Why is spiritual language so hard to access in the first place? Why does so much of it feel like it's written a code you haven't been given the keys to yet? Well, that's not an accident, and it's not a you problem either. Once you start to understand the reasoning around spiritual language, a lot starts to make sense. And this is what we are going to talk about in today's video. Why is spiritual language so hard to understand? Part 1. Language was built for a different world. The first thing to understand is that language was never designed for this. Language evolved to help us survive, to name objects, warn each other of danger, coordinate, and communicate. It's extraordinarily good at describing physical, concrete things, things that you can point to. But spiritual experience isn't any of these things. When someone tries to describe a feeling of oneness or divine love or the sense that time completely dissolved during meditation, the vocabulary just isn't there. Theologians have a word for this: ineffable. It means an experience so profound, it literally defies description. And this isn't a modern problem. Think about Rumi, one of the most celebrated poets in history. He didn't write poetry just because he was simply a poet. He wrote poetry because every time he tried to describe what he was experiencing in plain, straightforward language, it fell apart. The experience was too big for ordinary words. Lao Tzu, the father of Taoism, literally opens his most famous text by telling you that whatever he's about to say is going to be inadequate. And Meister Eckhart, a 13th century Christian mystic, kept describing God using contradictions. Not because he was confused, but because every time he tried to pin it down with a clean, precise definition, something essential was lost. These are people from completely different parts of the world, different centuries, different traditions, and they all ran into the exact same wall. That's not a coincidence. That tells us something really important about the nature of what they were trying to describe. Part 2. The words themselves have never been defined. But here's a layer that I think is the most practically frustrating and the one that doesn't get talked about enough. It's not just that spiritual experiences are hard to describe, it's that the core definitions around them have never been formally agreed upon. Words like enlightenment, the Holy Spirit, energy, and even soul. These get used constantly across books, teachers, and traditions, almost never with a clear shared definition. Everyone assumes everyone else knows what they mean. No one stops to define it. Take the words soul and spirit. People use them constantly, often interchangeably. But what do they actually mean? Are they the same thing? Are they different aspects of consciousness? Are they different layers of the human being? Depending on the traditions, answers can change completely. Some systems distinguish sharply between the soul and the spirit. Others merge them together entirely. And yet conversations continue as if everyone shares the same definition. This is actually a huge part of what this channel is about. So much confusion in spiritual conversation comes down to people using the same words without being defined, and nobody really stops to check and make sure that they're referring to the same thing. A big part of the work I want to do here is going back to these foundational terms and actually try to define them, because you can't build real understanding on a foundation of undefined words. Part 3. The brain is the bottleneck. Now here's where things get interesting. Even if we had perfect language, we still have a problem, because the organ we're using to process all of this isn't built for it. The human brain, especially the prefrontal cortex, runs on linear logic. It thinks in cause and effect, past and future, me versus you. It's a survival machine designed for a three-dimensional physical world, and it's extraordinary at its job. But source or God or universal consciousness, whatever language resonates with you, doesn't operate linearly. It's boundless, nonlinear, and outside of time. And asking the prefrontal cortex to fully grasp that is like asking a calculator to compose a symphony. The tool is just wrong for the job. The philosopher Aldous Huxley described the brain as a reducing valve. His idea was that if we experienced the full unlimited reality of source all at once, we couldn't function. We'd be so overwhelmed, we'd forget to eat or sleep or just stop talking altogether. The brain filters the infinite down so we can focus on the finite and survive. The result is that any genuine spiritual insight has to be downsampled to fit through the human neurons. It's like running advanced software on a 1980s computer. The computer technically can run it, but only by stripping away most of the complexity. When you're listening to a mystic or reading their work, what you're receiving is a low resolution representation of something originally far more richer and much more complex. The vagueness isn't the point, it's just what survives the translation. And to give an example of this, throughout history, there are accounts of mystics whose experiences seemed so overwhelming that ordinary functioning temporarily stopped altogether. Ramana Maharshi, after a profound awakening experience, reportedly entered states so deep where his awareness had merged so completely with pure consciousness that he lost all connection to his physical body and others had to care for him. After 2 years, he gradually returned, began to speak again, and went on to become one of the most significant teachers of enlightenment in the 20th century. His experience pointed to something important. When the reducing valve opens too far, too fast, the human system simply cannot hold it. The language that eventually came out of him was the best translation he could offer of something that was, at its core, beyond translation. Part 4. Paradox is intentional. This is also why spiritual language uses so much deliberate contradiction. The silence that speaks, lose yourself to find yourself, the emptiness that is full. These literally read like nonsense, but that's the point. When your rational mind hits a genuine paradox, it stalls. It has no category for it, no way of resolving it, no logical next step. And in that moment of stalling, the linear mind recognizes its own limitation, that no amount of additional thinking is going to get it anywhere. And in that recognition, pure awareness gets a chance to come forward. Zen practice built an entire practice around this called koans, unresolvable riddles like what is the sound of one hand clapping? The student isn't meant to find a clever answer. They're meant to exhaust every avenue of logical thinking until the mind finally surrenders. And in that surrender, in that silence where your thought stops, pure awareness steps forward. That's what the koan is trying to show you. So when you hit a spiritual statement that sounds to contradict itself, don't dismiss it. It may be one of the most sophisticated communications in the whole book. Part 5, a quick but important warning. I do want to say one thing, because not all spiritual vagueness is innocent. Vague language can be exploited. For example, statements broad enough to apply to almost anyone, or teachings where the meaning quietly changes over time, and somehow it always seems to change in favor of the people holding the power. Or teachings that keep you dependent on the teacher for meaning rather than pointing you towards your own experience. That's a real thing, and it's worth being aware of. The hallmark of genuine spiritual teaching is that it constantly points you back towards your own direct experience, towards your own capacity to feel, discern, and understand. The moment a teaching starts to require you to outsource that discernment entirely to someone else, that's worth pausing on. A question to ask yourself: does this vague language point towards your own inner experience and growth, or does it point towards the speaker? Genuine spiritual language opens doors. Manipulative vagueness locks them and keeps the teacher holding the key. Lastly, consciousness catching up. Which brings me back to where I started. The reason I couldn't read A Course in Miracles 10 years ago wasn't because the book was badly written. It was because my consciousness hadn't expanded enough yet to meet it where it was. Spiritual texts are sometimes written at a level of awareness that they're describing. And if you haven't yet grown into that level of consciousness yet, the words are just going to sit there on the page, flat and inaccessible. And that's not a failure. That's just where you're at in the process. So if you bounce off a book or a teacher or a tradition, don't write it off. Put it on the shelf, do the work, keep expanding, and then come back to it. You might find that the words haven't changed at all, but suddenly they're landing in a completely different way because you're reading them from a different level of consciousness than you were before. So to end, spiritual language is vague because it is attempting the impossible, using a tool built for the finite to describe the infinite. The writers aren't confused. The traditions aren't being evasive. They're doing their genuine best with a fundamental limitation every mystic across every culture has run into. The language is a finger pointing at the moon. The mistake is staring at the finger. If you are someone who's ever felt frustrated by how unclear and undefined so much of this is, that's exactly why this channel exists. We're going to pull these words and concepts apart, sitting with them seriously and doing our best to actually figure out what they mean. So, if that's something that you would like to explore with me, make sure to like and subscribe. And remember to tune in, listen deeply, shift completely, and bloom. I'll see you in the next video.